Greetings, this is Management 430, Human Resource Management, and this module lecture is on International Human Resource Management. This is under the umbrella of talent management as a competency because what the skills and the knowledge that we need to manage international employees is very different than the skills and knowledge we need to hire and manage our domestic employees. So we are covering this in this module simply because there are a lot of different and unusual things that we need to consider when we're managing our employees in an international context. So very similar to labor and how we manage our labor unionized employees and what those standards are that are different in terms of how we manage them. As you may have learned in other courses, when we say a company is global or they're international, it's not a one-size-fits-all. There are different ways that organizations can engage globally. For some, at the lowest level is imports and exports, right? I import things from other countries. I export things to those countries back in return, so I can sell to people globally even if I don't have any employees in a global context. And vice versa, I can import things, and yes, I might send people to those countries to do the buying and to look at the merchandise and decide which products I want to buy internationally, but then those things get brought here to the United States. And as you know, we are in a global trade war, to say the least, with the president making decisions about how to handle tariffs and how that will minimize imports coming from other countries. Now, again, there's strengths and weaknesses to that, right? I mean, their argument is, well, that means that manufacturing will be brought back to the United States. And it may very well happen, but the goal is to decrease prices and costs to increase profits. So if it is cheaper to import it from another place rather than building your own plant and developing an infrastructure to do that, then perhaps that's not always the best option. And that's a cost-benefit analysis that you need to do. It's like, what would it cost you to import it, even with the tariffs, versus what it would cost you to set up a facility and manufacture it here. And we don't know what that number would look like because obviously it's going to vary from company to company. But that being said, that impacts the decision making that an organization needs to make when they know that there are tariffs that are going to impinge on their ability to freely trade with other countries, particularly countries where we had a good trading relationship. So that's always a concern. And it certainly then impacts human resource management because if we are finding that the tariffs are decreasing the demand for our products, because we have to pass on that cost. We pay a higher cost, and then we pass that cost on to our buyers. We may decide that we need to lay people off, or we may need to decide that we are not going to be in that business anymore, and we may need to, redirect what we're doing. It may mean that we need to retrain people to do something else. So there's all sorts of implications for that. A multinational company is one where the company operates in multiple countries, but the headquarters is very clearly designated here in the boundaries of the United States. And so Apple, for example, is a multinational company because the headquarters is here in the United States, but it has plants, manufacturing plants in China and other areas across the country. So that's an example of a multinational company. A transnational company doesn't really have a headquarters anywhere. It's just located everywhere. They're widely dispersed. It's kind of borderless, and they don't really consider any one country their center of operations. And I have to think about what a good transnational country would be. A company would be. I can't think of one off the top of my head in this precise moment. Other things that companies can do to connect internationally and globally. um, is doing things like offshoring. And offshoring is where a multinational company may move their operations to a different country, or at least some of their operations to a different country in order to decrease their costs. And again, this is what I was implying when we talked about um, exporting and importing. If it is cheaper for me to manufacture it in another country, then that is what many countries would do. And then they would uh, bring them back, and manage it that way. Um, so obviously, offshoring has its pros and cons as well. When we offshore, we lose some degree of control over the quality of our products because we are, the work is being done elsewhere. We have to have as much control as we can over that process because we want to make sure people are trained properly on the standards that we set for ourselves to make that work. And again, as we were saying, when there are high tariffs, even if you're offshoring and then bringing it back, that's still considered an import, and that still creates more costs on top of what the cost is to produce the products. And so you've got to do your own cost benefit analysis to decide, does offshoring make sense in this situation? Outsourcing is where you move some of your operations to a different company. So offshoring means I move my parts of my company to another location, but I still control that company. Outsourcing means I look for somebody in another country that can do that work, and then I outsource the work to them. And that's really where we have the least amount of control. Like offshoring, we have some control, right? Because we own that company. But we still don't know what that labor market is like. So that's the big question mark, right? And how are we going to be trained? How educated are those people? Will they have the skill sets that we need to be able to do that? And that's always the considerations when a company wants to go global. They consider what's going on, in terms of the education level of the workforce. Do they have the skill set that they need, et cetera, et cetera. Outsourcing is the least control because now I'm building a contract with somebody else to do the work, and I really have very limited control over the output other than to put things into a contract and say this is what we want, this is how it should be, and ultimately if they are not meeting standards, then that interrupts my ability to make my products and deliver my products to my end customers. When an organization has to make a decision about how they want to handle the diffusion of their HR practices, do they want to have a standardized, centralized approach to human resource practices where the way that we behave here in the United States is the same standards that we set for people in other countries in terms of ethical norms and things like that, or the standard HR practices in terms of rates of pay and benefits and things like that? Or do we want to let it vary, right, from place to place? Because the standard of living in one country is very different than another, and we want to make sure that we are meeting the standards of that country, but we don't necessarily have to exceed it. Certainly, that's some of the reasons why, and I'm not saying I agree with this, but one of the reasons why organizations will do business and and offshore to other countries, because in offshoring they can set costs and salaries and benefits based on the local area. Now, there's a huge controversy a number of years ago when Nike was doing work in other countries, and their salaries were quite low, well, compared to United States standards. But they actually weren't low compared to the standards of the country in which people were doing the work. So that was one issue that was a concern, but understandable, as long as people were paying more than one would expect in that local country. So the other issue, though, of course, with Nike was there was apparently some labor abuses and things like that were a concern, which is why people were up in arms about doing um, you know, offshoring um, work in other countries. So Nike was under controversy for a while about those sorts of things. A lot of people were protesting and boycotting Nike um, back in the day, probably before you all were born. Um, and there were some concerns around that, but they've managed obviously to repair their reputation in those circumstances. But when you vary, right, the variance is going to be different from country to country because the norms are different from country to country. Now, some of the advantages of standardizing is that everything is very consistent. There's one set of rules, there's one set of benefits, there's one set of ethical norms and standards that we hold everybody to. There's a common culture no matter where you go. So you could pick yourself up here and you could move to Latin America, to your headquarters in Latin America, and it feels very similar, right, to the way that we do business and the way our norms are set here in the U.S. Obviously, there's going to be some slight cultural differences. Obviously, you can't avoid that because you're not going to hire all American people and send them to that foreign country, right? You're going to have some that are stationed there, but most everybody will be locals that you'll be hiring. And so obviously culture to culture, right? Country to country, there's going to be some subtle differences in that, but broadly speaking, the norms, the stories, the standards, the expectations, no matter what, will be relatively similar and consistent across the board. So if we have local differentiation, as I said, that might be better depending on the country and how compatible our cultures are. If they're not very compatible, then we probably will need to work within the bounds of what that country culture is like in order to set up our business there. And recognize this is not an on-off switch, right? This is not it's either decentralized or it's centralized. It's either local or it's standard, right? That's not the case. It's like everything. It's a continuum. It goes from one extreme, meaning very hands off and very decentralized, to very centralized, and there can be any variance in between those extremes. So some countries might be more standardized, companies might be more standardized in their approach than others, and other companies, allow for some more local variation. And again, the decision that we have to make in HR is how much do we allow to be local? What are the essential things that we want to have standardized control over? If it's about salaries and benefits, then we make sure salaries and benefits are really standardized. If it's about ethical norms and company policies and the way that we treat each other in the company, then that is the stuff that's standardized. So you can standardize some things, but not everything. And so hence you get that continuum between very decentralized to very centralized in its approach to things. The most important thing, obviously, is we want to have some shared values, right? Is having a shared understanding about what matters to us. And we may accomplish that in different ways depending on the country and how compatible the cultures and norms are. But having some at least shared values is important, even if we attempt to accomplish those shared values in slightly different manners. So let's talk a little bit about legal context and how that varies. Um, Obviously, legal constraints here in the United States are different than legal constraints in other countries. And if we compare, for example, the European Union versus the United States, we're much looser in terms of our laws, believe it or not. I know a lot of people here in the US are like, "Oh, it's so constraining." It is not constraining compared to the EU, where there are very clear dictates about how we treat employees and how we protect their identities and their privacy and things like that. And this is, an agreement amongst how many countries about what those standards are. Um, that doesn't mean people don't violate them, but nonetheless, the standards are there. So if you are going to do business in that context, you have to be planning to adhere to those standards. So when we think about the differences in the laws, as many of you identified, right, in the first module, the differences in the laws in other countries versus in the United States, you have to take into account the employment laws and how they are different in the country in which you want to do your work. A big part of this is unionization rates, and as you will learn or have learned by listening to the unionization and labor lectures, unionization rate is much higher in the European Union and in other countries, although our union representation is declining here in the U.S. It seems to be picking up in some arenas, but by and large, it's still lower than it was a number of years ago. Um, the European Union has a very different standard when it comes to labor laws and labor unions. They are more embracing of labor unions than we are here in the United States. And you will need to accommodate the way labor is managed when it comes to unionization in other countries in a way that's very different than the way you do it here. So your labor relations will be managed differently depending on where you're doing your business.